Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our January, almost at February, our January monthly buzz. Here it is, approaching mid-January already. I can't believe the bee season is here. I mean, even if you are in northern climates, the days are getting longer now, and bees are starting their growing season. So, we've got a lot to cover tonight. My name is Blake Shook. If I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you, I am one of the owners of the Bee Supply and love keeping bees. I get to work bees all the time, and I've been keeping bees for almost 20 years now. And one of the things I love to get to do is jump on here and educate and visit with other beekeepers. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for watching the video. And we got a lot of fun stuff lined up for this evening. Um, if you haven't joined us before, then like I said, welcome. We've got a little bit of introductory things to go over, and then we're going to jump out into the bee yard and see what the bees are doing out in the bee yard, and then we'll jump back into the classroom. We'll do maybe 30, 40 minutes of what you need to be doing in your bees right now. And then we're going to be doing some live Q&A tonight. So those are always fun as well. I'm actually at the American Beekeeping Federation conference tonight. It's in Reno, Nevada this year. And so I was at the Bee Expo conference last week in Louisville, Kentucky. And then this week is the American Beekeeping Federation conference, and two of the two biggest bee conferences in the US. And so I'm here all week, and it's been an exciting week. It's just getting started. But I'm live streaming from there tonight. So let's jump in. I want to talk really quickly as we get started here. This is a new product that we just launched last week. I'm pretty pumped about it. Global pollen patties are my favorite pollen patty. It's what I use in my own commercial beekeeping operation, running tens of thousands of beehives. And it's what I recommend you use for pollen patties. But they've never had a dry mix that you can either make your own pollen patties with a dry mix or open feed with Global. We've been working with them for quite some time, and have developed this dry powder mix with them. So this is something that you can open feed, which we're going to talk about later tonight, because that's a great method to feed in the winter. Or you can take this and make your own pollen patties out of this dry mix. So I'll talk about how to do that later on, but pretty excited about this new product. If you haven't ordered bees yet, now's the chance. We've got our 30-day guarantee. If anything goes wrong with your bees, bring them back within 30 days and we'll exchange them for you. We also have our bee warranty. So you can buy our bee warranty. And if your bees die within your first year of beekeeping, we'll replace those for free as well. So we're the only company I'm aware of that we came up with the idea of a bee warranty because, especially when you're brand new to beekeeping, so many new beekeepers lose their bees. I mean, well over 50% of new beekeepers lose their bees. And that's super discouraging, especially since bees aren't cheap. So, excuse me. So we developed this bee warranty where you can buy the warranty, and like I said, if anything happens to your bees, then we'll give you a new beehive the following season. And then if you don't use any of your bee warranties, then we'll give you a 50% refund on the warranty. So it's hard to lose on the bee warranty. I will say I will say that if you haven't bought bees yet, we're going to be doing. I don't think it's technically on our website yet, but we're about to do a price increase for the new year. So I'd highly encourage you, if you plan to order bees, to go ahead and get those orders in. So, Sherry, what do we have going on this month on TBS topics? It's all yours.
How's everybody? I think, you're talking about it's spring in the bee's head, but I'm gonna tell you what, winter's just now hit Southeast Texas and we don't like it. We barely got out of Louisville, Kentucky because we were at the expo as well. And I'll tell you a little about that in a minute. But yes, we do have some great January topics. And let me tell you about them really quick. All right, week one, Best apiary setups, super good article for those new beekeepers that are really needing to get out there and start thinking through what you're going to do, how you're going to lay out your bee yard. Super great article. Beekeeping tools, same thing. If you don't know what you need, this is a super great article for that. And even for experienced beekeepers, because there might be something in there that you hadn't thought about. Week 2, how to protect your apiary from varmints. I'm going to talk to you about a little bit more about that in a minute. Understanding varroa mites. Yes, y'all, it's time to start talking about that again. But we have to, right? It's our job, and we're going to make sure that we get you everything you need to know about that. Week 3, how to start beekeeping business. I love this. How to make a profit with beekeeping. You know, our bees, we want them to pay us back, right? We've got blood, sweat, and tears in that, and a little bit of money. We'd love for them to pay us back. This is a super helpful article that helps you really get started. It's got some great tips in there. And which should you buy, nuke, package, or full-size hive? This is a super easy article to read, and it might give you some insight if you're kind of on the fence of which to do. And then lastly, week 4, beehive management, reversing brood boxes and combining hives. So this sounds probably like deja vu all over again, because we just talked about this in the fall. But guess what? We have to be rethinking this. That's why it's in week 4, end of January, because at the end of January, 1st of February, that's when we release. In some regions, we really have to start doing some manipulation. So those are going to be very timely at the end of the month. And then you'll get a wrap-up email of all of that. And I'm ready for the next slide. So, there we go. I know. Well, Blake's in Reno, like you said, so we're kind of maybe a little delay in the talk there.
Could have taken 2 hours, yeah.
Could have taken 2 hours, right? Because that's the time. You're right. It could have. So my January focus is about the varmints and livestock. So part of this is kind of, to me, is comical, but it's only comical if you haven't had this problem. This picture is from Ross Conrad. If you don't know who he is, Google Ross Conrad beekeeper. He's kind of famous in the industry, and we had the pleasure of meeting him years ago and actually getting to dine with him and get to know him. Super, super neat guy. But he took this picture. That, my friends, is mice that have built more than a home in a beehive. But let's kind of go over some points to make. In the article that's on, I think it's already up. I'm pretty sure that it is. It starts off talking about bears. They really are the most destructive. Thankfully, we don't have to deal with them, but I bet you that 1 or 2 of you out there does. In most areas, it's the least threat, but in some areas, it's really a big deal. And they have to do electric fence around their bees, and even that, sometimes the bears can get through. So, that's the thing. But we talk about it in the article. Livestock is more of a nuisance because they like to scratch up and use it as a scratching post. So typically you'll see beekeepers will put up like a barbed wire fencing, just a nice taut wire fencing around it, and they won't try to push through that typically. And we go into detail about that. Small mammals and rodents can create havoc, and that's what that picture is there for. It's super interesting to read about that. Insects, wax moths, ants, wasps, small hive beetles, termites, they are all threats. And I know that we've gotten into great detail with wax moths, ants, and small hive beetles in lots of articles. If you're looking for that, go to the Bee Help or just under our TBS monthly articles, and we've got a lot on those in detail. But in this short article, you can find some good information. Varroa mites, I'm not even gonna go down that road. They're there, they're more than a nuisance, they're #1 issue for us, but we're about to get used to dealing with it. If you're new to beekeeping, don't let it scare you. It's just part of our job, right? Everybody go, yes, not at once. Yes. All right, the takeaway, managing pests like varroa mites are a given, but challenges from wildlife and livestock aren't typically a daily issue and most often easily managed. And that's the truth. And I hope that this article will help you with that. And I'm just going to finish this up and then turn it over to Blake. We had a blast at the expo. If you have not done this, plan for 2026. So this is our booth. We had 1,000 square foot booth again this year. This is TBS's third year to do this. And we actually were more than just TBS this year. We actually included our commercial bee supply, our bulk bees and our pollination and I'm sorry. Oh, it's the family. James said, he's telling me, he says, it's our family. It is our family of businesses. It was super great booth. But one thing that was super kind of close to my heart is I got to invite some of my very close friends that happen to be YouTube influencers in the industry, and we had a ball. I talked to Randy Oliver, if you don't know who he is, scientificbeekeeping.com. Oh gosh, I'm gonna forget. Bruce Jen. Help me here. Fred Dunn. I should have written down my list.
You got it.
Corey Stevens, Yappy, B-Man, Dirt Rooster, Mr. Ed. I had all of these folks in our booth, and it was great. And I'm going to do it again next year. So if you haven't been, you need to go. Anyway, oh, and it was cold. Gosh, we almost didn't get home, y'all. We were right, but we literally got out of Louisville right as that storm was hitting. We've got friends that didn't get home till last night, 3 days later. But we got out on time. All right, I'm done, Blake.
Great. Thank you, Chari. And Chari did an amazing job working on the booth, making it incredible. And our whole team did a wonderful job. So it's exciting. It's an exciting event. Highly encourage you guys to go as well. Just real quick, I mean, as I'm at the American Beekeeping Federation conference this week, so it's top of mind. And a huge topic of discussion is the Tropolalaps mite. I mentioned it in one of our videos a couple months ago that it's a new mite that is theoretically worse than the varroa mite that we're watching closely. And, we don't know if it's going to get to the US. It probably will. We don't know when. It might be in a year. It might be in 5 years. Hopefully it's never, but it is growing its territory pretty dramatically throughout the rest of the world. And we tend to get whatever the rest of the world gets, eventually it tends to make its way here to the US. So at some point we'll probably get it here. But the great thing is that we have a lot of scientific teams, a lot of bee inspectors, a lot of beekeepers that are all working hard to figure out how to beat it once it does get here. So that's good. When the varroa mite came in the late 80s, early 90s, we were not prepared as an industry. The industry learned its lesson, and we've already got research teams going to Thailand and Korea on a routine basis from the US to study the Tropolalaps mite, or the tropy mite, or the T mite, so that when it does come, we're prepared. We have an action plan, a game plan, et cetera. So, of course, here at the Bee Supply, we'll keep you fully informed, and we tend to hear the most up-to-date research. And then, of course, in my own commercial beekeeping operation, we're creating plans on how to deal with it as well. So long before it gets here, we'll educate you guys. We'll talk about how to handle it. But it is a major point of discussion at all the beekeeping conferences these days, because it's probably the next big thing. Okay, let's jump out into the bee yard and see what the bees are doing. Now, I'm going to give a little bit of a caveat here because Chari mentioned that it's getting cold in Texas. Texas has several inches of snow, which is absolutely unusual. If you're from northern states, you probably think it's hilarious that our whole state shuts down when we get an inch of snow. But it's true. We don't know how to drive in the snow. We don't have the machinery to deal with the snow. And so it's been a little bit too cold to get onto the bees this week. Even before it was snowing, it was well below freezing. It's been a really cold week. We barely in a lot of areas in Texas, in a lot of the South even, we just have not had much of a winter. It's been very warm. And now this past week, it's finally gotten really cold. So I didn't want to jump out and dig through a bunch of beehives this week for The bees' sake and for my sake. I really just, gonna be honest. I've been at conferences in the last 2 weeks, and then I just really didn't want to get out there and bother the bees. So I pulled a couple other videos that I've done that are really important to share for this time of year. So let's jump out. This will be a few different videos from a few different spans of time, but they're all really important for the month of January. So here we go. Let's jump out into the bee yard and see what the bees are up to.
Let's talk a little bit about moving beehives. Now, moving bees is never fun and it's really never easy, but it's often really important. I usually find that I'm needing to move bees in one of three ways, or one of three reasons. One is that I want to move this hive, a couple feet or 3 or 4 feet in this direction. Just a really short move. Maybe I'm, want to redo the stand, or I want to, move them from this flower bed to that flower bed 3 or 4 feet over. Those are pretty easy. The other situation is I want to move it, 100 feet away to the other side of my yard or property. That's the most complicated one. Or I want to move it to a whole new location that's, say, half a mile away. That one's easy too. If you're moving bees more than about a half of a mile, the bees are going to completely reorient to their new location, and you can just pick them up and move them. A cool day, the colder the better, whether it's 20, 30 degrees, is great to move those bees those longer distances, or even a shorter distance. If I'm just wanting to move this hive 4 or 5 feet in one direction, you can just pick it up and do that at any time. It's really not a big deal. The tricky thing is, if I want to take this hive and I want to move it 20 feet that way, those forager bees are probably going to come back to this area, not recognize their hive, and they're going to go into this hive. So bees are going to go usually to the nearest hive of their old location if their original hive isn't there. So if I move this hive, 20 feet, all the foragers are going to end up in this hive. So that gets really tricky. If I were to move both of these hives 20 feet, that's a little better, because then nobody knows where home is, and they're going to reorient. They're going to recognize that hive 20 feet away, and they're probably going to kind of drift evenly over there to those hives. So if you can use this to your advantage sometimes, if you're in the spring or summer months and I've got this hive that's really weak and this hive over here that's really strong, I can swap places with them. And then my foragers from my strong hive are going to end up going into the weak hive, and that can boost that weak hive strength. So you can use that to your advantage, just swapping hives, and that way you give a weak hive a boost of population. If you are trying to move beehives around in the winter months, it's awesome because the bees aren't flying as much. And that's really the key, is that even if it's 20 degrees outside, if this is a really strong hive and I start moving it around, bees will oftentimes come out. So you still want to suit up, close up the entrance loosely, and then get some help, lift that hive and move it to a new location. But be prepared for bees to come out. Or worst case scenario, you drop this hive, you crack the boxes apart, and then bees are really going to come out. I recommend, if you are going to move bees when it's really cold, strap that hive together really tightly so the boxes don't break apart. Because if those boxes do break apart, you drop everything, and it's 20 degrees outside, any bee that falls out of the hive is going to die. It's going to freeze. So use a strap like this one, band it all the way around the hive, strap everything together really tightly so that doesn't happen. But other than that, moving bees in the cold is great, because you aren't going to have, in general, 10,000, it's an exaggeration, not 10,000 bees, but you're not going to have 100 bees come out and try to sting you when you move them. But prepare just in case something goes wrong. I don't like moving bees if it's below about 20 degrees. If it's like in the teens or below freezing, any jostling, any bees that fall down onto the bottom board inside the hive, it's too cold for them to climb back up into the cluster, and they're probably going to die. So kind of 20 to 40 degrees is your sweet spot, because at those temperatures, if it's a good strong hive, even if bees fall onto the bottom board, they'll still often crawl back up. It's warm enough that they'll crawl back up into the cluster. So 20 to 40 degrees is your sweet spot. You can move bees long distances or really short distances. If you're moving them 20 or 30 feet, ideally move all of your hives 20 or 30 feet rather than just one. If you do want to just move one and it's a really strong hive, you can oftentimes just pick it up and move it 20 or 30 feet. Yeah, the next warm day, those foragers might end up at this other hive. But again, if this is a really good, strong, healthy hive, it's not gonna cause an issue for them to lose, 3, 4, 5% of the bees to that neighboring hive. So, but overall, this is a great time of year if you need to move hives any distance. This time of year, I really like to start thinking about rotating frames. Once frames get old and dark, it's a good time to pull them out of the hive and throw them away and get new frames in your hive. And really my favorite time to pull them out of the hive is early spring, late winter, early spring, before the bees really start brooding up. But you can start preparing for it this time of year. Now, if a hive dies, which unfortunately happens, or you have a completely empty box, you can pull the old dark frames out and throw them away. That's not an issue. The tricky thing is if you have a hive that doesn't die for 2 or 3 years, which is kind of hard to do these days, but if you do have a hive that doesn't die for 2 or 3 years, you might want to try to rotate out old frames while the hive is still living. And so what I like to do is in the late fall, early winter, kind of right where we are now, I'll go through a hive and I'll identify the old dark frames. So this hive really only has one old dark frame, and I'll show it to you. So this is an old frame. You can see the wood's pretty old. The comb is pretty dark in color. It's not terrible, but it's not great. I'm gonna go ahead and swap it out. And by the way, you can see this is completely capped honey, and it kind of has a white, it's a little bit white on top. That's very common to see in the winter months. They kind of get this white patina on the capped honey, and that's pretty normal. But, so I've identified a frame I want to rotate out. As long as it does not have any brood on it, and it's just a frame of honey like this one, I'm going to get it all the way to the outside of my box. So I'm just going to get it on the very outside frame, and I'm just going to leave it just like that. What's going to happen is if the bees need that food, it's there for them all winter. I don't want to throw away a frame full of honey because the bees might need it. So I'm going to leave it in there, and then I'm going to come back, late winter, early spring, as the bees are starting to brood up, flowers are starting to bloom, and I'm going to check on this frame. And if it's full of honey still or not, I'm going to pull out that frame. If it's full of honey, I'll set it out, let the bees rob the honey out of it, and then I'll throw it away. But that way it's on the outside edge. If it were closer into the middle, there's a good chance in the late winter, early spring, the queen is going to start laying eggs in that frame. And then I don't want to throw it away because now it has, eggs or larvae or brood all over it, or the bees have started filling that valuable early pollen in on that frame. But on the outside edge, now I've guaranteed that it's there over the winter if the bees need that honey, and I've guaranteed that I can pull it out and get rid of it in the late winter, early spring before the queen starts laying brood on it. So that's what I do. If you have 2 or 3 frames of old frames you want to get rid of, as long as they don't have brood on them, right now, shuffle them to the outside edges, and then you can pull them out and throw them away in a few months. So it's pretty simple. That's all you have to do, and you can do that in both boxes. And it's great to kind of always be rotating those old frames to the outside edge so that you can get rid of them. Usually I recommend rotating comb about every 10 years. If you buy bees in a nook or a single story hive, they're probably going to have some old frames mixed in. And so you can go ahead and start rotating those out. But about every 10 years is what I consider best management practices to rotate out those old dark frames. If you get a new hive or new equipment, I recommend getting a Sharpie and writing the year on the tops of the frames, and that'll help you rotate out those old frames and know what year they were brand new. So hopefully that helps and helps you get rid of some of those old frames, which can be a little more contaminated and heavy with that old wax. And this is a great method to get them rotated out if the hive doesn't die. Let's talk a little bit about sugar bricks and how to install them. So I've got one of our sugar bricks here in our packaging, and sugar bricks are a great way to feed this time of year if your hive still needs food. So if it's still 75 degrees on average outside, if it's October, I feed syrup because the bees can store it more readily in the combs and they can utilize it more quickly. A sugar brick, it's gonna take a little longer for them to eat, but you can put it directly on top of the cluster, which is what's important this time of year. So sugar bricks are a great option if your hive still needs food this late in the year. So I recommend feeding them, mid-November through late January is a great time of year to use sugar bricks. I love this one that Stan developed, which is the one that we sell because it has some protein in it. It's got, lots of different vitamins and minerals in it. It's a great resource for the bees. I like it because it's also a form of insurance. So if you think your hive may not have quite enough food, it doesn't hurt just to throw a sugar brick on and let them eat it throughout the winter. So there's a number of different ways you can install a sugar brick. You can put it directly on top of the hive. The big thing I look for is I really want it to be right where there are a lot of bees, because your bees need direct access to this brick in order to use it. So, we've got this hive, and you probably can't see from the video very well, but there's a lot of bees all the way up in this top box. And so I want that sugar brick where the bees have easy access to it. If there's no bees in your top box, you might want to take the top box off. And so there's a number of different things you can do. You can put down a sheet of newspaper and put the sugar brick on top of it. I like to just put it directly on top of the top bars. It's okay if it's a little crumbly. Sometimes I like it to be in 3 or 4 different pieces because it gives the bees better surface access or more surface access to the brick. So I like it to be in a handful of pieces, and I'm going to put it right in the middle, right on top of where the bees are clustering. And then you can take, we sell these are just an overwintering inner cover, and it's a little bit deeper. As you can see, it's got a deeper opening. And so that allows plenty of space for those sugar bricks. And then you can put your telescoping cover right back up on top. A shallow box also works. So if you just get a medium or a shallow box with no frames, that can work as a spacer. If you can, I don't recommend it quite as much, but you can get a shallow box or a rim like this. You can take a box and cut a couple-inch rim, and you can put the rim between 2 of your boxes and a sugar brick between 2 of your boxes. The reason I'm not always a fan of that approach is you're really separating your boxes, and it's harder for the bees to cluster when there's that gap in between them. So in general, I really like the sugar bricks to go directly on top of the hive, just like this. And if there's, like I said, if this box were completely empty, then I would either pull it off and put the sugar brick, on top of this box where there's more bees, or I would take this box, if it's full of honey, and I would actually put it on the very bottom underneath this box. And that way the bees could still access it if they wanted it. And you could put the sugar brick on top. So you can always move those boxes of honey, if they don't have a lot of bees in them, down to the very bottom, and the bees can pull from it, as they need it throughout the winter. But the cool thing is, you probably can't see it in the video, but there's already bees all over these sugar bricks. So they're already covering it just in a couple of minutes. The bees really love them. It gives them something to do throughout the year. So it's a great tool for this time of year when the bees need feed. Hey friends, my name is Blake, and I'm one of the owners of the Bee Supply. I've been keeping bees a really long time, almost 20 years now. I started when I was 12 years old as a high school hobby, and then went into it commercially, raised thousands of hives, and now run thousands of beehives in addition to being a part owner of the Bee Supply and helping with our education. And a really common question that we frequently get is, hey, I'm a new beekeeper. Should I buy a package of bees? Should I buy a nook? Or should I buy a complete single with bees in it? The good news is, it's up to you. There's no wrong way to get started in beekeeping. There's a few pros and cons to keep in mind as you're considering starting this beekeeping journey. A package of bees is the cheapest way to get into beekeeping. It's significantly less than other options. It's just this plastic package, and it's going to have about 3 pounds of bees on the inside of it. So it's really simple. When you receive this package, you just pop the lid open, and you're going to dump this package of bees into a complete hive that you have prepared before the package of bees arrives. Now this will have a queen in it, so it'll have a mated queen in a cage that you'll install. we've got other videos showing you how to install a package of bees into your hive, and we'll certainly share that with you once you make a purchase, or you can check it out on our package page for free. So this is quick, it's easy, it's simple, it's cheaper, but it's also slower. So it's going to take these bees all season long to fill up this box. If you're lucky, they may fill up a second box. It's unlikely they'll produce any honey in their very first year. So this is a fine way to get started, but it's the slowest way to get started in beekeeping. It also tends to be a little higher risk. That doesn't mean it's a bad option, but it's a little bit of a riskier option because more things can go wrong when you're only starting with bees and a queen instead of brood, which we'll talk about in a minute. So great option if you're trying to cut corners or be on the cheaper side of beekeeping. I know it's an expensive hobby, so if you're trying to keep the cost down, this is the way to go. If you have old equipment from maybe a previous beekeeping journey, if this is your second year of beekeeping and your hive died, this is a great way to repopulate existing comb or equipment. So the other option, the next step up, is a nook. And so this is what we call a 5-frame nook. This outer plastic container is disposable, and it'll come with 5 frames of bees in it. So this will have 5 frames on the inside, and all those frames will be drawn comb. And so it'll have the honeycomb already drawn out in 5 frames. It'll have a laying queen. It'll have 2 to 3 frames already full of brood, and it'll have 3 to 4 pounds of bees in it. It'll also have a frame or 2 full of honey. So this is a nook or a nucleus hive. It's a little baby hive that's ready to go. And so you would take this home with you, and then you would install this in the equipment that you've bought and set up beforehand. And it's easy as that. You just transfer the frames out of this nook box into this empty box that you've bought ahead of time, and you're good to go. Now this builds up much faster because you've already got developing baby bees. You've got 2 to 3 frames already full of developing baby bees. They're ready to hatch out and give that new hive a boost in population. The queen's already accepted, the queen's already laying, so this is just a faster way and a more reliable way to get started in beekeeping. The final option is to buy a complete hive that's already ready to go. Now you've got to buy this equipment. Even if you buy the nook or the single, you still have to buy this equipment, but we can also sell this equipment populated with bees for you. This is the fastest and best guarantee to make a honey crop in your first year. Still no guarantee that you will, but this is your best shot. So it comes with all the brand new equipment, the bottom board, the lid, already full of bees, ready to go. All you have to do is take this home with you, put it out in your backyard or your field, put another box on top for them to start filling with brood and honey, and you're good to go. There's no installation. The queen's already laying. It's the most foolproof way to get started in beekeeping. It's the most expensive, but in reality, when you price it out, if you look at the price of a nook or a package and the price of all the equipment together, it's not that much of a difference. So this is quick and easy and fast. The others are a little bit cheaper, a little more complexity, but great options as well. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We are always here to help you. We love answering questions, and we're here with you for the duration of your beekeeping journey, whether it's your first year or 10th year. We have unlimited educational resources at your fingertips, and we're just a phone call away. Happy beekeeping.
Sorry about that. All right, so this is what I'm about to be dealing with. So this is California, where the biggest pollination event in the world takes place. The picture on the left was from 2023, rained throughout the whole pollination event. And then the picture on the right was this past year in 2024, rained through the whole event. You can see the mud. And it's that time of year again. So a lot of my employees are already out in California, grading bees, getting bees ready for almond pollination. If you're not familiar with almond pollination, 90% of the world's almonds are produced in California, and it takes virtually every commercially managed beehive in the country to pollinate the almond crop. And it's about 50% of the revenue for most commercial beekeeping operations. Cool thing is, it's actually really, really good for the bees to go to almond pollination, which is a huge misconception. You know, I hear it from hobby beekeepers, even some commercial beekeepers that haven't experienced California. I've heard it's bad for the bees, or I've heard they get diseases out there. And after doing it for 20 years, I've not had that experience. There's the almond pollen is incredibly good for honeybees, incredibly high in protein, and they grow incredibly well because it's warm with a great flow out there when the rest of the country is still freezing cold. And then I've never come away with a disease that the bees didn't already have. They're not actually that close to that many other bees. They're spread out amongst, a 500-mile long valley. So anyway, I'll be giving you guys some cool videos, some cool pictures in the February monthly buzz. Everything is just now getting started, but I'll be spending a lot of time out there over the next month, and I may even be doing our February monthly buzz from California. But I'll be having lots of cool videos, and hopefully it stays dry out there because when you're moving, um, 1.5 million beehives into almond orchards, if it's muddy and wet, makes for a long month. So hopefully that is not the case this year. Okay, so here comes spring, maybe. Before this week, I was actually seeing a trickle of a pollen flow in some of the southern United States. I mean, it had been so warm. Dandelions were starting to bloom a little bit. I saw some Bradford pear trees almost starting to bloom. We were shaping up to have a really early pollen flow, but this cold that has swept through the country has pretty much knocked all that back. I mean, even in Florida, it's chilly. And so it's normal. I mean, it's supposed to be cold in January. It is winter, but those early pollen flows have all been completely knocked back. I wouldn't expect anywhere in the country, other than a few pockets here and there, to have any significant pollen flow for the next few weeks, just because of this freeze. So spring's not here. Weather has reminded us once again that January is wintertime, and it's going to be chilly. These are some of the blooms I would expect to see. I mean, your dandelions, your henbits, your asters. I even saw some clover last year early, which is not normal. That was a fluke. But any of your mustards, your willows, your elms, those are all things I expect to see blooming according to these dates. So this is a map that I built. So go easy on me. But these are the dates in the corresponding colors are the dates where I usually see a significant pollen flow start. Now, I'm not talking about, oh, that bee had pollen on its leg, 1 out of every 20 bees has pollen. I'm talking about, okay, almost every day, the bees are starting to bring in a significant amount of pollen, enough that they can really start growing. And so based on talking to a lot of beekeepers in all these regions, and then my own experience in most of these regions, this is when the major pollen flow typically starts. So this is when the bees really start growing in these dates. So hopefully that's helpful for you, as you're trying to guess as to when your pollen flow starts and when to expect your bees to really start growing. This is pretty accurate. Obviously there's a 2-week span in there, because it does vary by a couple weeks depending on the year, but not normally more than a few week variance. So longer days are here. Brood rearing begins in a lot of regions, but little to no pollen flow. We've had a very mild early winter, and now we're having a lot of cold. That doesn't tell me a lot as a beekeeper, other than I'm going to be paying close attention to my bees' food stores once this current cold spell goes away. Because when we have a really warm winter like we've had to date, the bees eat a lot more food, because the bees are out flying and they're not clustered as tightly, and they can eat a lot of food, burning through energy as they go out of the hive when it's 45 degrees and sunny. And now we've had a really cold spell, and now they're clustering and consuming food. Once they come out of this cold spell, I'm going to do a quick check on my hives to make sure that they don't need some extra food, whether that's a Stanislaus sugar brick or some liquid syrup. If you're way far south, there's a good chance that your bees might need some food after this cold spell. Here is the 8 to 14 day temperature outlook. I start looking at these maps as spring gets closer because it gives me a clue as to when my bees are going to start growing, how much I need to pay attention to food, when might I be able to do splits. Now, these, of course, are not completely accurate, but this is the 8 to 14 day temperature outlook. And so, based on where you are in the country, you can see what is being projected for the next, almost to the end of January if we go 14 days out. So I won't read the map for you. You guys can all see it, but that's the current weather prediction. And then here is the seasonal precipitation outlook. So this is January through March. So this is spring, basically. These are the precipitation outlooks that you can see. And this doesn't necessarily have a dramatic impact on your bees, but it can. If this is accurate, the wetter it is, the more you need to watch out for things like European foul brood. The drier it is, the less you have to worry about that. The wetter it is, the slower bees are going to grow. The drier it is, usually the more bees are going to grow, but you might have to do a little more feeding when it's drier. So again, this isn't a science, but it starts giving me some clues as to what my upcoming season is most likely going to look like. And of course, just keep in mind that regions vary greatly in January. In some parts of Florida and Georgia, southern Mississippi and Louisiana, South Texas, by the end of January, we'll have hives with drones. I mean, there'll be pollen coming in every day, bee flight every day, 4 or 5 frames of brood. And then, you can go to the northern part of that same state and they may be just getting a pollen trickle. Whereas our friends up in Michigan and Minnesota are still buried in, feet of snow. So January is all over the place. This is when we really start watching our bees because, if they're brooding up like crazy, time to think about treating for varroa mites and time to think about, feeding more versus if they're still buried in snow, not a lot you can do. Let's see here. Winter feeding. So my goal, really, no matter where I am in the country, my goal once I get to January is just to maintain 30 to 40 pounds of stores in my second box and 3 to 4 frames of honey in my bottom box. So that really puts you more like at 40 to 60 pounds, depending on, your strength, hive strength. But my goal is to just maintain. I'm not trying to get them to put on weight. I'm not trying to make them have 60, 80, 90 pounds of honey. I'm just trying to maintain that weight now until they start bringing in some natural nectar. If a hive has less than 30 or 40 pounds and they're a deep box full of bees or more, feed now. You might need to use a soft sugar brick. You might need to use some fondant. On a warm day, you can try feeding syrup. Um, I feed a 2-to-1 syrup in January and February rather than 1-to-1. In late February, early March, well, let me rephrase this. Once I have a significant pollen flow start, I switch to 1-to-1 because 1-to-1 sugar water helps the bees build up faster, stimulates brood production. So that's when I'm going to switch more to that 1-to-1. But when my bees are not bringing in a lot of pollen and they don't have brood, I'm sticking with 2-to-1. I'm using division board feeders or top feeders rather than entrance feeders, or I'm using, soft sugar bricks. I'm wanting my food to be inside the hive because and then January, it's too cold for the bees to go out of the hive or even go to the front entrance of the hive to get food. I want my food right next to as close to the bees as I can possibly get it. So that if they're clustered, and it warms up a little bit during the day, they may break that cluster enough to go up and get a little bit of food or go to one side and get a little bit of food, but they're usually not going to go all the way down to the entrance. So if you have the goal as a beekeeper, if you say, you know what, I want to get as many hives as I can, or I really want to grow my hive counts this year, these are some strategies I employ to get my bees to grow a little bit faster. Now, it's not going to like turn 1 deep box of bees into 2 deep boxes of bees in 2 weeks. But if you do these things, you'll have a few extra frames of brood beyond what you would have had otherwise. So 2 weeks before my pollen flow begins, so if you think back to that map that I showed you earlier, 2 weeks before my pollen flow begins, I feed small amounts of 1-to-1 syrup when I get a warm day, I try to keep maybe a quarter of a gallon of 1-to-1 syrup on my hives. That'll stimulate the bees. I feed high protein pollen patties like global. So I'm going to get like a 15%, 4% works too, but a 15 or 4% pollen patty, I'm going to start feeding that 2 weeks before the pollen flow. And then I'll probably open feed pollen substitute as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. And those three things are going to stimulate the queen to start laying a few weeks earlier than she otherwise would have. Now, if you do all this and you're still 4, 5, 6 weeks before your natural pollen flow begins, it's probably too cold and it's too early, and you're not really going to be successful at stimulating them at much. But 2 weeks before, it's the bees really want to grow at that point, but they just don't have the food and the protein coming in to do so. Giving them that food and that protein will help them go ahead and jumpstart and get rolling on production. Something else I see a lot in January is bees, animal feed, sawdust, and neighbors. So when you do have a warm day in the dead of winter, when there's no pollen coming in for the bees, those bees are hungry. They are desperate to forage on anything that even sort of resembles pollen. And so they're going to go to the chicken feed and try to get the dust out of the chicken feed. They'll go to a wood shop or garage and they'll try to gather up sawdust. I have more problems with neighbors complaining about bees sometimes in the winter than I do in the spring, because the bees are bothering their chickens or they're in their animal feed, and the bees are just looking again for anything that resembles pollen. There's no nutritional value in the dust that they're gathering. It's not helping them, but again, they're looking for anything that sort of resembles it. What I do to combat that is I do open pollen feeding. So if I've got a neighbor complaining about bees in their sawdust or in their chicken feed, number one, I recommend to that neighbor that, well, close your garage door or sweep up that sawdust, or can you just feed your chickens early in the morning? And that when the bees aren't flying, I explain to them what's going on. Hey, the bees don't have any forage, dead of winter. They're just looking for anything that resembles dust or pollen, and educate them. Give them a jar of honey, and a lot of times that will calm things down. But if that doesn't work, then open feeding pollen is another great tool to get them to pay attention to something else other than whatever's going on over at your neighbors. And then I let the neighbor know, hey, I'm going to put out some food for them to try to divert their interest away from your animals, which they usually appreciate. So putting out this open pollen substitute it's good for the bees, and it can also divert their attention. It works really well when there's no natural pollen available. Once you have any significant natural pollen flow, the bees usually completely ignore the open powder. But when there's no pollen flow and it's a warm day where you can have bee flight, they will go crazy. They will go crazy on that pollen substitute. I mean, it'll look like, the picture there you see there on the bottom left. I mean, they'll just swarm it. And this can help stimulate brood rearing in January or 2 to 3 weeks before your natural pollen flow begins. It's not critical. It's not life or death for your bees, but it can give them a boost. And I will say, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to watch them forage like crazy on that open pollen feed. They look like they coat themselves in the pollen substitute, and they look like these little ghosts flying away out of the pollen feeder. You can buy these blue pollen feeders, they're a little pricey, 100 and something bucks, that you can dump pollen substitute in, and it's made for the bees to forage inside. I like to use the plastic Pro Nook boxes. So that's what you see in the middle here. That yellow front entrance plate. So you can see not the lid, but the yellow ventilated front entrance plate. That's removable. So I pull that completely off, and then I'll put a few pounds of pollen substitute inside the Nook box and then seal the lid on it. And that's a perfect sealed environment to store the pollen sub, and then the bees can fly in and out of that entrance that's exposed now to forage on the pollen sub, and it keeps it dry if it rains. So I put through, well, you can put more than a few pounds. You can put 5, 6, 7 pounds of pollen sub in that Nook box, put it up in a tree somewhere so animals are a little less likely to eat it, and the bees will just go nuts for it. You can also just get a 5-gallon bucket cut the lid in half, seal it on it, put pollen substitute on it, and then lay the bucket over. And that half lid will keep the powder from falling out, but the bees can still fly in and eat the pollen substitute. That works as well. It's not quite as weather tight as the Pro Nook box, but if you've got a 5-gallon bucket laying around, that certainly works as well. Which, of course, I have to give another sales pitch. That's great for our new product, which is our dry global pollen powder. And you can also make pollen patties with it. So there's instructions on the bucket. So it's a oh shoot, that bucket's like a 1-gallon bucket ish. It might be a 2.5-gallon bucket. It's not a 5-gallon bucket. It's either a should know this. I just stared at them at the the Bee Expo conference for
I
2 or
think
3
they're
days.
3-gallon. I think it's a
3
3-pound,
gallon.
3 pounds.
Well, it's got 14
No,
pounds of
no,
powder in
that's
it.
right. 3 gallons,
3
3 gallons.
gallons. Okay, all right.
I
So I was
think.
completely wrong. It wasn't 1 gallon or 1.5. Or 2.5. So yeah, it's like a 3-ish gallon bucket. It makes 17 pollen patties. That's what I was trying to get to. So, so if you get this and you follow the directions, it makes 17 pollen patties. The cool thing about this formula is all you have to do is add water. So it's a just add water product. So you get the bucket, add water, mix it up, you've got pollen patties. And it's cheaper than buying the pre-made patties, though a bit more work. But if you buy the bucket, then you can choose, you can do some open feeding and you can make some pollen patties. And it's a little more economical than, having to buy that 50-pound sack of dry powder. So speaking of feeding pollen patties, I kind of covered this already, but you can feed it a couple weeks before the main pollen flow begins. The only other time I'm really feeding pollen patties in the spring, once I have a good pollen flow, is when I have an extended cold period in the middle of the spring when the bees are already have a lot of brood. So if I'm, in Texas, for me, that's going to be, mid-March, my bees are going to have 6, 7, 8 frames of brood. And if I have a cold front blow through and there's 7 days where the bees can't get out and forage, they can burn through all their pollen stores in that 7-day period and start cannibalizing brood. It's not going to kill the hive, but they may eat a lot of that brood, especially the larva, because they're out of resources to feed it. So if I have brood in my hive and I see they're not going to be able to forage for 7 days, then I'll throw a pollen patty in there just to keep the brood rearing going. I want to touch on this topic really quickly. Is cold good or bad for bees? So I see it all over social media. Every time you have these Arctic polar vortex cold spells come through, in the December, January, February, everybody panics, what's going to happen to my bees? Are my bees going to be okay? And, typically your bees are going to be just fine. I view cold weather as similarly, that's not right grammar. Uh, I view cold weather in a similar way that I view wax moths and small hive beetles. Wax moths and small hive beetles aren't going to kill a good, strong, healthy hive. But a really weak, small, already dying hive can be overtaken and killed by small hive beetles and wax moths. Now, the small hive beetles and wax moths didn't kill the hive. They just were the final cleanup crew to what else killed the hive, which is usually varroa mites way back in the summer, and their virus levels got high and they didn't finally die until fall or winter. So cold is similar. When I see a cold snap like this, it may look like it killed some hives, but in general, those hives were already on the path to death anyway. They were already too small. They were already too weak. And the cold, the cold was kind of the final thing that wiped them out. So I don't usually worry about it killing good hives. In extreme cases, it can. If you have a really strong hive that's really short on food, they can starve to death during a cold spell. But a strong hive, or even a half a box full of bees, should have no problem keeping themselves warm in these cold snaps. overall, I feel like bees tend to do better when a winter is consistently cold than when you have a really unusually warm winter. And that seems counterintuitive because we're used to, as beekeepers, we want to see our bees fly and we think activity is good. Warmth must be better for animals than cold. And that seems logical. But bees do well when they get a break. And when the bees are able to completely shut down brood production, when the queen is able to completely shut down, when they're able to, bees are built to hibernate. When they go into that hibernation period for a month or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 months, that's actually good for them. I as a commercial beekeeper, I have to do this. I get to do this for a living. And so I have to make sure that whatever I'm doing overwintering wise with my bees is really, really good for the bees. So um, I have the choice. I live in Texas. I could overwinter all of my bees in Texas where it's typically warmer winters, but I don't. I overwinter my bees in indoor climate controlled sheds in Idaho where it's 43 degrees for 4 months. My bees are stored indoors at 43 degrees for 4 months. They don't break the cluster for 4 months. The queen doesn't lay for 4 months. They don't come out of the hive for 4 months. And my survival rate went through the roof, and the quality of my bees went through the roof, as opposed to overwintering in a really warm climate where they're flying 2 days out of every 10. So consistent cold can be a good thing for bees. Now there's a happy medium there. I would say consistent, -10 degrees for 2 months. So that's not good. You can be too cold, but the perfect overwintering conditions for bees is about 40 to 45 degrees for 3 to 4 months. That's pretty perfect for bees. So, um, one other topic I want to get to before we do some live Q and or some answer some of your questions and do some Q&A is my hive queenless or just not raising brood yet? That's a question a lot of people have as we not that we're coming out of winter, but a month from now, we're going to be coming out of winter. You're going to be able to start inspecting your hives in more southern regions or even some central regions. And a lot of folks can be concerned because they say, well, I don't see any eggs. So is my hive queenless or is it just too early? Here's what I ask when I'm checking my bees. Is there a pollen flow and does my hive have food stores? If there's a strong natural pollen flow and your hive has plenty of stored honey, you should have eggs. What are the weekly temperatures? If I'm inspecting my hive and it's been 7 days of near freezing temperature, okay, maybe I don't expect to see eggs. But if it's been 55, 60 degrees for the last 7 days and the bees have been bringing in pollen, I expect to see eggs. Did you see eggs and brood during the fall? That would be a key question to ask. What's the population like? If I've got one frame of bees, I don't expect to see eggs nearly as quickly as in that hive as I do a hive that has 10 frames of bees. So the stronger the hive, the earlier I expect to see eggs. And then I would say the biggest question for me, if I have more than one hive, is there brood in my other hives? So do my other hives in the same bee yard, do they all have eggs? If they've all got eggs and this hive doesn't, it's probably queenless. Another thing that you might see this time of year is moldy frames. And these are all pictures of moldy frames, especially in hives that have died. Moisture gets in over the winter, and you can get this white or blue or green mold on your frames. The good news is not a problem. It's not toxic to the bees. It's not going to hurt the bees. It's easy to get rid of. When I see this, all I do is I just get a water hose. I spray it all off of the frame, shake all the water out of that frame, and then just let that frame air dry, and you're good to go. If you stick that frame wet back into storage, it's going to mold again. But if you wash it, rinse it out, shake the water out, let it completely air dry, it'll fully take care of the mold. So it won't hurt the bees at all. How many dead bees should you see in front of your hive? What's normal versus abnormal? As you're looking at your bees this time of year, you'll start to notice that there's some dead bees on the front door. The picture on the right is very normal. I would say dozens maybe even 100 dead bees in front of your hive, pretty normal. I mean, your winter bees are starting to die off, and you're going to see an increased bee death. Picture on the left where you've got thousands or many hundreds or thousands of dead bees, that is not normal. When I see that this time of year, to me, that indicates a hive was probably either robbed out, died and robbed out, or they've starved. They've had a mass starvation event. And now, when the weather warms, what bees are left alive are trying to clean out all of the bees that starved. So, what do I expect to see as I'm checking bees in January? I expect to see minimal but increasing brood. That depends on the region, but a lot of regions I expect to see a little bit of brood, kind of like what you see in the picture here, but increasing brood. I expect to see some pollen stores, maybe more in late January in southern regions. Um, and then I want to see at least 20 pounds of stores and honey in the second box. If I don't see that, I'm panicking a little bit. My goal is more 30 to 40 pounds that I'm maintaining. Should you ever combine hives in January? Good question. So I'll take a quick peek at my bees, even if it's sunny and 35 degrees. I'll take a quick peek at my bees. I'm not going to pull frames out, but I'll break boxes apart and take a quick look. It's not going to hurt them. I do it at least a couple hours before sunset, so the bees have time to reform their clusters. But yeah, I'll take a quick peek. But if I'm trying to decide if a hive is going to survive the rest of the winter or not, I'm going to make sure it's a pretty warm day, because a strong hive can look really weak at 30 to 35 degrees because they're really tightly clustered and it's hard to tell how many bees are in there. So before I would combine two hives together, I'd want to make sure it's at least 60 degrees and I'm getting a good feel for how many bees are actually in the hive. If hives have, I would say, 2 frames of bees total or less, yeah, probably worth combining. But in general, my rule of thumb for January is if they've made it this far, let's see if they can make it to spring. I'm probably not going to be like giving them a lot of food and giving them pollen patties and all that because, they're probably not going to make it if they're, 2 or 3 frames of bees. Um, but if they've made it this far, it's not going to hurt anything to leave them out there and just see if they make it. So I'm not a huge fan of combining hives in January. I usually just leave them be at this point and see if they can make it. Something else you'll see on warm days is the bees doing a lot of cleansing flights. So when you get that warm sunny day where the bees can actually fly, you may see a lot of activity in and around your hives as the bees take a bathroom break. I mean, if they've been clustered inside that hive for for a month or even a couple weeks, and then you get a sunny day, they've been holding it in for just a minute. And so they need to get out and go to the restroom. And so don't be surprised by a flurry of activity coming in and out of your hive on warm days in late winter. I remember my first, I don't know, I'd been keeping bees for a couple of years. I was in my teens, and so I was still living at home. And I kind of knew I knew what cleansing flights were, and I probably had a dozen hives at that point in my parents' yard, and we would get these warm days in the winter, and my parents had 2 white vehicles. And we get these warm days, and the bees would go on cleansing flights, and my parents would find these little yellow and brown dots all over their cars. And of course, it was the bees going to the restroom, and but they didn't know that, so they're always like, "My goodness, what are all these dots that are so hard to scrub off of our cars?" It's like every sunny day in the winter, we've got these dots all over our cars, and I was always like, "Huh, no idea, no clue what that is." Um, but if you do have white cars, you may notice on warm days in the spring that they've got some yellow and brown dots all over them. By the way, it is hard to scrub off. I found that the best thing to do is on a rainy day, go through the car wash after that's been pre-soaking for 4 or 5 hours, and then it comes right off. But it takes a couple hours of soaking before it'll really come off the car easily. You should see it when our bees go, like I said, they're stored indoors for 4 months in indoor storage sheds. When we bring them out after 4 months being indoors, you do not want to be in that bee yard, nor do you want any vehicles in that bee yard when the sun comes up their first day out. It's like a brown rain. You do not want to be anywhere close because they've been holding it in for just a minute at that point. Okay, so we've got a little bit of time left. We're trying to shorten these monthly buzzes down a bit, but we want to do probably 15 minutes or so of live or Q&A where we take some of your questions. So you can put questions in the Q&A box if you want me to answer them. And then Chari will be on as well. And when I get stumped, Sherry's going to jump in and help answer the questions that I can't.
Yeah.
But we'll read off the questions so you can all hear what the question is, and then we can answer them. So you can go ahead and start putting any questions you've got in the Q&A box, and then we'll
I've got
get
one for you
rolling.
to start with though,
Okay,
that already came up, and I
let's do it.
want, what about the California wildflower fires? Is it
Uh,
affecting the almond pollinators?
yeah, so I mean, I'm sure you guys have all seen the pretty tragic fires going on in California. So interesting thing about wildfires in California. So for the most part, California wildfires almost never impact almond pollination. And certainly the fires going on right now are having no impact at all. The reason is that the Central Valley is where all almond pollination occurs. And the Central Valley is pretty much 100% farmed. So the wildfires are getting going up in the foothills and the mountains where there's brush, there's something to burn. Um, and so we never see fires in the Central Valley that affect the almond orchards. The fires are all up in the hills. There's homes up in the hills, unfortunately, but there's no farming up there, so we're always safe from the fires. And typically, we don't see fires that time of year. It's usually a little wetter, even in the mountains on either side of the Central Valley. We don't usually see fires that time of year either. So, I mean, in 20 years of doing it, I've never seen a fire that was anywhere close to damaging the primary area of the Central Valley. Sometimes way to the north or way to the south, you might run into some potential issues. But all the fires are in Los Angeles County, which is probably 2 hours south of the nearest almond orchard. So yeah. So thankfully,
That's,
no impact. It's a
that's good
big
to know.
state. Yeah, yeah.
Very good to know. Okay, you
Um,
got some questions coming in.
yeah,
Want me to read them, or do you want
fantastic.
to just read them?
Um, I can read them off. Someone says, I am purchasing several colonies from a business that is closing down. They have branding on their boxes. Would it be okay to paint over it while the bees are in there? Or is there a solution that doesn't require rehoming them in different equipment? Great question. So you can absolutely repaint hives while bees are still in it, any time of the year. I mean, it's great on a warm winter day when the bees aren't really flying, but the paint will still dry. Absolutely. I would use a latex paint because it dries quicker and you're not going to risk bees getting stuck in the paint. But a good latex paint on a sunny day, you bet you can certainly paint that hive. I've painted hives even in spring and summer. Just smoked the hive pretty well and quickly painted one coat on the outside, and bees, I've never had a bee get stuck. So you bet you can absolutely repaint a hive when the bees are still in it. John, you asked how many nooks can be installed in a bee yard on the same day. So, guessing if you're buying nooks, how you got to install them in their equipment once you get them back home. How many can you install in a day? I would say it's a function of your capacity, not what's going to bother the bees. So, I mean, if you've got the manpower and the willpower to install 1,000 in a day, go for it. The bees aren't going to be impacted, so I wouldn't worry about it from the bee standpoint. It's just more of how many you think you can get installed in a day. And that's really just going to be a factor of how familiar you are with bees and beekeeping, how well laid out your equipment is. If if you've been keeping bees for 10 years, you might be able to install, 100 nooks in a day. If this is your first time ever getting into bees, you might be able to install 20 in a day. It just depends on how familiar you are with bees and beekeeping. But from the bee standpoint, it's not going to bother them. They're going to be eager to get into a hive. Greg, you said, Blake, you mentioned late winter to early spring is a good time to replace old frames that have dark and blackish wax. At that point, can the wax be used for foundation or should it be discarded? It's a good question. So technically, you could melt down that old black wax and try to use it to recoat plastic foundation. You're going to find there's not much wax in there. There's in those old black frames, there is surprisingly very little beeswax left. Basically, what that comb is made up of at that point is cocoons, because when a baby bee is developing inside of a cell, she's going through a process of spinning a very tiny cocoon, and then that gets pasted to the outside of the cell when she's done. And so every time a bee hatches, a tiny thin little cocoon gets pasted to the outside of the cell. And once you've got a frame that's 10, 15, 20 years old, it's just cocoons, really. There's almost no wax left. So you're not going to get much wax out of those old dark frames. And then secondarily, wax absorbs everything from the environment. It absorbs every chemical that gets put into the hive. It absorbs chemicals that the bees interact with outside the hives. And so for that reason, I'm not a big fan of using that old black beeswax because it's decently contaminated at that point. Is it really going to hurt your bees if you apply it? No, probably not. But as little wax as you're going to get out of it, you're going to put so much effort just getting the wax out of it. You can go buy a pound of wax way cheaper than your labor is going to be trying to save that wax. So,
and I'm going to interject and say that it
please.
won't melt. I
Yeah,
won't
yeah,
hardly melt because we saved in our beginning journey, saved a ton of that. And
right.
we had like gallon Ziploc bags in the freezer and there's nothing there. I think I got it
Yeah.
all melted down. It was like paper thin and it just wouldn't melt. It was
Yeah,
terrible.
yeah, yeah. It's just
Toxic.
yeah, it's mostly cocoons, and so yeah, you
Yep,
can't melt the
that's it.
cocoons. Yeah, yeah. I've put those old frames through a wax melter and gotten them out, and they look just like they did when they went in because there's just nothing to melt out of them. John, you said you described spraying off mold and cleaning old frames with a hose, then letting them dry well. Would you also put them in the freezer? So once those frames have really dried, I would say you can store them in the freezer or with wax moth crystals, or if it's below freezing outside, you can just store them in the garage. They don't need any special treatment if they've had mold. The key is just to make sure that they completely dry. If they're still wet, they're just going to grow mold again. So once you spray the mold off and they completely dry, you can store them in whatever way you typically store comb. Marilyn, you asked, when should I take the hive wraps off? So if you have hive wraps, whole nother topic of conversation, which we usually talk about in going into winter. As far as taking them off, it's a good question. I should have had a slide on that. So for me, I want to take off any insulation or wraps when the daytime temperatures, I would say, are starting to get up into the 50s. When your night times are in the 30s, daytimes are in the 50s or low 60s. That's usually when I'm going to start pulling off the wraps. Because what you want to avoid is you don't want a surprising 75, 80-degree day to suddenly hit. And if you've got like a black wrap on your hive, it can really overheat that hive. So most areas where daytime temperatures are in the 50s and nights are in the 30s don't wrap hives at all. So once you get to that point, I would pull it off. George, you said with 4 double deeps on a pallet. So if you look at the picture here, this is commercial setting. This is us in North Dakota, actually. We've got 4 beehives to the pallet. So George, you said with 4 double deep hives to a pallet, are the 4 entrances facing 4 different directions? No, actually not. So they're 2 facing one direction, 2 facing the other direction, which means that some hives have entrances that are couple inches apart, and they do fine. So we really don't have any fighting. And so, yeah, you've got 4 hives on a pallet, each inches apart, and entrances that are only a few inches apart, and bees do just fine. Nancy, you said, odd question. If you freeze a drone frame, can it be fed back to the hive as protein? That is an interesting question. So if you've got a drone frame that had drone brood in it, and then you freeze it with the drone brood still in it, it's usually part of a mite management program. Can that be fed back to the bees as a protein source? So I'm going to say no, because larva or pupa, though the bees do cannibalize them, they cannibalize, though, in a dearth period, or if the bees run out of other food, they will cannibalize brood. But it's as much for their own nutrition as, or it's to, uh, my brain isn't connecting with my tongue tonight. It's as much so that they don't have to feed that brood as it is that they need the food. So they're cannibalizing it to get rid of it, so they no longer have to feed it because they don't have the feed to feed it. It's not so much that it's this great food source for them. So you can put that drone frame back in so the bees can clean it out, but I wouldn't use it as a feed source. I would use a pollen patty. That's a much better, more complete source of protein for them. That's a great question, though.
And it's old, and once it's been frozen, it gets kind of slimy, and
Yeah,
you're just going to reject it as if it's kind of rotten. So
yeah, yeah,
chickens like it.
yeah. Chickens like it, and the bees will clean it out if you need it cleaned out, but not as a
Yeah.
food source. But great question. It's unusual that I'm like, I've never been asked that before, and I've never been asked that. So cool. Todd, you have a hive impacted by a late season mosquito spray. It remains to be seen if they'll make it through the winter. If they do, how long is the hive impacted by the residual pesticide in the wax, honey, etc.? So the testing I've done and have seen on wax and honey, the mosquito spray doesn't usually significantly impact honey or wax. Not enough of it usually makes it into the hive to contaminate wax or honey. So that's not usually a problem. Far as how long that impact it will be on the bees, I don't know. I mean, I would say that in my experience with mosquito sprays, the primary impact is usually relatively quickly, and so the impact within that first month is usually the extent of the impact, and then it's just a matter of, is there enough bee population to survive after that? So I wouldn't. I've not seen any research, and in my own experience, have not seen it continue to have a residual impact for months afterwards. It's usually just that first couple of weeks that you have that major kill, and then it's a matter of, yeah, is there enough bees to survive the winter?
I want to interject on that too, because we're
Please.
in Southeast Texas, and we get
Yeah,
sprayed. Okay. The treatments is usually it's a contact kill. And
yeah,
by the next day, it's evaporated off of the grass, and it's dried up and it's gone. So the impact on the bees is when the spray happens. That's why when we know a spraying is going to occur, we put, if we can get to all of the hives, we put a roof over the front, or a sheet over, or a piece of burlap or something that prevents that drift from getting on them and contact kill. Typically, if it's a pesticide kill that's going to be a residual, that's one where they got into something that they brought back into the hive, and it really created a long-term problem. It's not so much that mosquito spray, but that's our experience with it.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I fully agree with that. Okay. Let's see. Alan, you said if you have an old frame, can you pop out the old frame and insert uh, a frame of or a sheet of plastic foundation and reuse the old frame? Absolutely. Sure you can. Yeah, you can knock out the old frame, old comb, stick a sheet of a new foundation in there and reuse it. You bet. Sometimes it ends up being more trouble than I mean, personally, I usually just throw the whole frame away and buy a $3 or $4 new frame. Um, but if you do want to replace it, you can absolutely do that. John, how's the best way to feed sugar bricks in a horizontal hive? Um, so you should be able to on the top. Yeah, I mean, there should be enough room. I would just lay the brick right over the cluster on top of the top bars on that horizontal hive. Steve, you found that when you want to store boxes with frames that have comb, wrapping them individually with clear shrink wrap and moth crystals works great, and they're easy to handle and stack. Have you ever tried that? I haven't tried it, but that's a great idea. Yeah, that's a great idea. I mean, you can individually wrap the boxes and put wax moth crystals, or you can just stack up 6 or 7 boxes and wrap the whole stack in shrink wrap and put wax moth crystals on top. I'm actually going to start recommending that. That's a great idea. If you've got shrink wrap laying around the house, or even saran wrap would work. I would say that my only hesitation could be that you want to make sure there's no moisture in that hive, because if you're wrapping them, sealing them up that tight with no breathability, um, you could develop some mold issues, which again, it's not like you can't clean it out, but it will mold if it's wrapped up really tight or if it's really humid without any breathing room. Um, but if it's really, really dry and you're in a really, really low humidity area, that could work great. I probably prefer to stack up 5 or 6 and just wrap the outside with shrink wrap and then put like a bee lid over the top. That would be actually that'd work really, really well. Nancy, you can't get your chickens to eat your drone brood. So this was the lady that talked about, will the bees eat that frame of drone brood? Yeah, so something's wrong with your drone brood or something's wrong with your chickens. I don't know which, but maybe it may be that it's so old and nasty at that point. When I've had luck getting chickens to eat that stuff, it's fresh. They'll eat it fresh, but yeah, maybe after it's been freezer burned, they don't care for it. Toby, how often should you put new moth crystals in the bags you're storing frames in? So as far as replenishing wax moth crystals, it depends. So I usually, and Sherry, you correct me on this because it's been a minute since I've used wax moth crystals. I think it's about once a month, ish, or maybe even a little longer. Once you don't see any crystals there,
That
once the crystals are gone, it's time to replenish.
we stack
Um,
ours, well, when we used to, we use Sertan now, that product. But we would stack, I don't know, what, 6, 7, 8 boxes high and put, the crystals in between every third box. Typically that would last about, 2 months, 3 months.
okay. Yeah.
You just go in and peek and see, open it up, crack the tape, because we
Right.
duct tape around
Right.
the edges and just poke our head in, but it lasts longer. If you've got it good and sealed on the top and the bottom and the edges, it will last quite a while.
Yeah. Perfect. And I would say that once you're getting freezing temperatures at night, as long as it's freezing where your comb is, you don't have to worry about wax moth crystals. So if it's not freezing where your boxes are, then they can the wax moths can lay eggs and eat your comb. The larvae can eat your comb. But once you get below freezing, and the wax moths have all been frozen away, you don't have to worry about replenishing those crystals. Uh, Robert, you said the good news, the DEC has announced that the murder hornet has been eradicated. Yes, so that you're right, that is great news. Now this is the murder hornet that was up in Washington State area that is really deadly to bees. Yes, the eradication so far seems to have worked, which, man, that's so unusual that an eradication works. It's wonderful. The yellow-legged hornet in Georgia and the southeast is an ever-growing problem that is not going away. But the murder hornet it was bad news. So yes, great news that seems to have, for the time being, been eradicated. So wonderful
Yay,
news.
yay on that.
Yes,
Yay on that.
absolutely.
We
Yeah,
don't need
thanks for.
another bug messing
We
with our
don't. We don't.
So I've got one for you that's a personal
Sure.
question. It's actually
Okay.
James said, the difference between 4% and 15% global.
That would be 11%.
I asked for that, didn't I? Okay,
Um,
let me
uh,
reword that.
okay.
What is the difference? What is the difference between the 4% global and the 15% global?
Yeah, so the only difference, the percentage is the percentage of real pollen that is in. So the 15% of the protein is real pollen, and the 4%, only 4% is real pollen. That actually has very little to no nutritional impact for the bees. The difference is the more natural pollen that's in a pollen patty, the faster they consume the pollen patty. So you're not giving your bees special nutrition by getting a 15%. They're just going to eat it and use it faster, which does help stimulate brood production a little bit faster. So you probably knew the answer to that, but great question. And thanks for bringing that up, James. All right, last question here, and then we'll call it a wrap. Teresa says, if we have a large growth of bees, say 12 frames, we are thinking of doing splits in mid-April. Is this too soon? We have 8 queens ordered from TBS for an April 25th pickup. Also, if bee growth takes off and we have 12 frames in mid-March, would putting on a third box on a help keep the bees from swarming to give us some time. So a lot going on there. Good question. So as far as when to split bees, depends on where you are in the country. If you're in Texas, mid-April, absolutely fine. You can start splitting in most parts of Texas in late March even. Rest of the country, I'm usually looking at how much brood my bees have. I want, a hive should have at least 6 to 8 frames of brood before I'm going to split it. Once you've got 6 to 8 frames of brood, it's ready to split. Yes, you can add a box if you don't have queens yet, your hive's getting really full of bees. You can add a box to help slow down swarming. When I do that, I like, if I'm adding a box specifically to slow down swarming, and I've already got 2 boxes on my hive, so if I'm adding a third box, I like to actually put it below my 2 deep boxes. For some reason, empty space below the 2 boxes tends to slow swarming down more than adding it on top. So something you could try there. All right, last question, because I've got to answer Todd here. Todd says, I had bees that seemed drunk this season. They were slow moving, convulsing, or frozen in place. Varroa mites were controlled, but had a large number of dead bees. What might be the reason for this behavior? Sounds to me like a spray. A pesticide spray can certainly cause those symptoms. So that convulsing, slow moving bees, frozen in place. Now, if I see that in the winter or the fall, and my bees are really low on food, they can be starving. They can be cold and starving when they do that. But I'm assuming based on the context of your question, that was probably more in the summer. It sounds to me like a pesticide issue, that they probably got poisoned. That's my best guess. What do you think, Chari?
I agree. Seasonal, whatever season it is, but if they're acting lethargic like that, or there's just something weird about them, it's gotta
Yeah,
be pesticide. I agree with you.
right. Yeah. So bummer.
I'm out of here.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Us too. I've got to get back to the conference. So thank you for jumping in with us, and cannot wait to see you in February. February, we're going to be packed as we really kick off the bee season. So stay warm, stay safe, and guys, we'll see you all in February.